Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing BDS, or the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Movement, which does encourage a BDS movement or a movement against Israel, and a pro-Palestine movement overall. Amnesty International has come out and has condemned a move by the U.S. State Department to label BDS on the of course, convincing of Pompeo as well as others within the Trump administration as an anti-Semitic movement overall, even though, to be completely fair to BDS, a significant number of Jews actually do support it as well as even some Israeli academics also. Now, Amnesty itself has said that BDS is a non-violent advocacy and free expression group that must be protected. I'm quoting its exact statement right now. The Department of State's targeting of groups advocating for using peaceful means to end human rights violations against Palestinians as anti-Semitic is in fact a gift to those who seek to silence, harass, intimidate, and oppress those who are standing up for human rights, especially, of course, within the Palestinian territories. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Farid, Esack, who is a professor at the University of Johannesburg and is the chairperson of BDS South Africa. He's joining us today from Johannesburg. Joining us this morning from Santa Cruz, California, is Dr. Stephen Zunes, who is a professor of politics at the University of San Francisco. Stephen and Farid, thank you both for your time today. Stephen, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of labeling BDS anti-Semitic?
It's an effort by the outgoing Trump administration to try to marginalize those who are demanding that Israel uphold its international legal obligations in terms of international humanitarian law and the like. I mean, the United States has always been critical of movements that have called for campaigns for corporate responsibility, for an end of U.S. support for repressive regimes, whether they be right-wing dictatorships or Latin America or the apartheid regime in South Africa or whatever. But this time, because Israel happens to be the only Jewish state in the world, they are disingenuously using the charge of anti-Semitism to marginalize these groups and to, for example, forbid the U.S. government from contacting them. For example, the State Department could no longer work with Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch in terms of getting human rights reports. Some of the Christian denominations, like the Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Quakers, and others who have endorsed BDS, at least in terms of the occupied territories. Here's the other thing that's interesting about this. They don't distinguish those who boycott Israel altogether with those who may oppose an overall boycott of Israel, but are willing to boycott the settlements or companies that specifically support the occupation. So for them, it's all Israel, and criticizing even just the occupation gives you this label.
What are your thoughts about this move? Because, you know, BDS would say, listen, as I said in my introduction, we have many within our ranks who are, in fact, of the Jewish faith, who even I, in fact, found a website which actually has a list of even Israeli academics who support, of course, parts of BDS as well. What are your thoughts about that?
There are a large number of activists across the world who support BDS. Of Jewish activists. I mean, even in South Africa, we have Jewish Voices for Peace. Jewish Voices for Peace is an international organization. And of course, as you pointed out, a large number of academics, but very many, not only BDS supporters. There is a strand, in fact, of Orthodox Judaism that does not recognize the state of Israel, let alone just support BDS, and who actively do support BDS. Very many of the Hasidic Jews don't believe in the state of Israel, but that's not the domain wherein BDS operates. BDS operates from a clear distinction between Zionism and Judaism. And we insist that given the fact that there are so many Jews who do not identify with Israel, and the fact that that Zionism is a relatively new phenomenon inside Judaism, to synonymize Judaism with Zionism, it is politically absurd. But there is wisdom in there for the political strategies of the various Israeli regimes, particularly with Netanyahu's regime, to synonymize and to equate the BDS movement with anti-Semitism.
Right. Steve, I'm sure, of course, you remember very, very well the days when BDS was just ridiculed, right? It was said that, this is a movement which will have no effect. A lot of Israeli officials came out and said at the time that, we don't care about this movement. It's not going to really affect us. Is this in some weird way actually, actually accepting the fact that, okay, BDS has actually had an impact?
I think so. The hysteria that's been going around it is quite remarkable. It's given the movement actually a lot more attention than it might otherwise. But it has been effective in the sense that even the Democratic Party has come out in opposition to BDS and the 2020 Democratic platform on which President-elect Joe Biden ran. They don't even mention the Israeli occupation. They don't mention the existing settlements, but which are illegal under international law, but they do condemn the BDS movement. Now, they do not call it anti-Semitic. This is something that Trump has taken it to a new level, but unfortunately the opposition has been bipartisan. But the good news, though, is that it is getting increasing mainstream support, at least as it's targeting the occupation, but in some cases the broader BDS call as well, because they recognize it is effective. I mean, given that the United States has blocked the United Nations from taking action vis-a-vis the Israeli occupation, given that the United States has refused to cease billions of dollars of unconditional military aid, given the failure of governments and international institutions to do what they need to do, that's when we bring in civil society. Again, an analogy with South Africa, when the vetoes by Britain, France, and the U.S. made sanctions impossible, and these corporations from Western Europe and North America kept going into South Africa. A global civil society took it on, and that's what finally forced the sanction on South Africa, which played a very important role in finally ending apartheid.
On top of all this, we've had earlier on, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance and its definition of anti-Semitism, which again also in many ways equates criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, and that has been adopted by I know many in the U.S. as well as now even a province in Canada, Ontario, where I grew up, and that's worrying as well, isn't it? Because it seems that the freedom or the space for freedom to discuss pro-Palestine policies or just Palestinian policies and what happens in the Palestinian territories, even in a very neutral fashion, that space is becoming ever smaller. Is that fair to say?
It's fair to say that it has been diminished. I mean, when a country like Germany or a state in Canada and now the United States go along and say that that Zionism is the same as anti-Semitism or anti-Jewishness, then it is bound to have an impact. However, the one thing that one should not dismiss is that this move to clamp down on BDS and redefining anti-Semitism, it has been rejected in several different parts of the world. It has been rejected in a number of United States appellate division courts. It has been rejected in some German lower-level courts, although Parliament has still stuck to its decision. It has been rejected in France. And so, yes, I mean, governments are notching up small victories here and there. But as Stephen pointed out, during the struggle against apartheid years, governments on the whole were completely in support of the apartheid regime, particularly governments in the global north. And in those very countries, in the United States, in Britain, and in Germany, that to a large extent, particularly Britain and the United States, supported apartheid, civil society in those organizations took to the streets and forced companies to act against the South African apartheid regime. And similarly, in this way, one looks at the victories that have been notched up by the BDS movement in the last 12 years, then we see that we see parallels here with the South African movement. So governments aren't really able to stop this movement.
To give you the final word before I let both of you go, on the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, I want to get your thoughts about that, A, and B, then on this issue of, the freedom to be able to discuss these issues in an open fashion, even debate them out, right? So I'm not saying that we need to have just a pro-Palestine voice only represented, a pro-Israel voice too, sure, but then why limit the voices who are on the Palestinian side? What does that achieve? It's not like those voices will just disappear, will they?
Well, not at all. But it's important to remember that social movements in support of national liberation struggles against those who are facing oppression have always been belittled, dismissed, suppressed. We've seen this, very often when. I, for example, I've been viciously attacked for my opposition to the Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara. There have been a long history of those when you have Western governments that engage in oppression, for Western governments just to belittle and cover it up while emphasizing and sometimes even exaggerating oppression by governments that we don't like, and because a lot of liberals, a lot of concerned people are concerned about anti-Semitism, as they should be, as we should be concerned about racism or sexism or other forms of oppression. This is kind of an area where they can kind of use this to get the support and sympathy of certain elements that would not otherwise buy into the typical pattern of support for a repressive right-wing government. So it's a tool that we have seen in certain ways in the past, but it gets extra leverage because they're kind of working on the liberal guilt and others who are concerned about anti-Semitism but don't know the details of Palestine and what BDS is about. But fortunately, it's not working. I mean, as I mentioned, even though the Democratic Party came out against BDS, polls show a overwhelming majority of Democrats are not opposed to BDS, and many, in fact, actively support it. So I don't think it's going to stop the movement as long as there is injustice, and as long as the United States is a party to that injustice. The BDS movement and similar campaigns that will continue.
Right, we'll leave it there at that, but we do sincerely appreciate both Stephen and Farid for their time today and for sharing their expertise with us on this important topic. Amnesty International coming out quite strongly, saying that what the U.S. State Department is now doing is essentially trying to limit those who are standing up for human rights. And as I said, it's not a question of trying to suppress the voices of either side, but it's now trying to suppress the voice of just one side, and preferring the other side over them, and then trying to label the other side racist just by default for daring to even stand up for the rights or to speak about Palestinian rights altogether. Does that make sense in any way? Is that where we want to find ourselves vis-a-vis trying to find a solution, a justifiable solution that would be agreeable to the Palestinians as well as the Israelis? This just defies logic altogether, doesn't it? I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to continue to discuss the fallout from the Australia war crimes report into alleged war crimes that may have been committed on the part of Australian special forces while they were serving in Afghanistan. Now, the report, of course, gives significant amounts of disturbing information about what may have occurred. The allegations are quite serious. 2 14-year-old boys being murdered, their throats were slit. Australian troops then bagged up their bodies and dumped them in a river. There was also then within the report talk of a cover-up culture within those who carried out these atrocities. There's a lot of questions being asked, of course, about accountability, what this means now for a change of culture, if that can even happen within the Australian Special Forces, and what exactly went wrong vis-a-vis the hierarchy and accountability even at the time that this was occurring, and certainly the effect that this has also on the Afghans, who all of this has already affected in the past and still does, of course, now. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Damian Powell, who is the principal of the Janet Clark Hall at the University of Melbourne. He's also served as an expert on the advisory panel to the Australian Human Rights Commission. He's joining us today from Melbourne. Joining us this evening from Adelaide is Andrew Goldsmith, who is the Matthew Flinders Distinguished Professor of Criminology at Flinders University. Andrew and Damian, good evening to you both, and thank you for joining us here in Scope. Andrew, I'd like to start with you. Firstly, just on the report itself, what are your thoughts about it? What are your thoughts about the details that are laid out vis-a-vis the allegations?
It's a massive report. I mean, it's nearly 500 pages. As an outsider, it's heavily redacted. So there's only limited information. Certainly the identity of the people at the centre of the allegations is not evident to me as an outside reader. But the level of effort put into this is quite impressive. And in terms of the analysis, I think there's a lot of points one can be made. But the notion of culture that you mentioned a moment ago is certainly very much in the centre of the analysis in terms of, what has the culture been, how's it gone so wrong, and what can be done to change it for the better.
Credit is being given to the Australian Army for, at the very least, coming out with the report. But at the same time, it's not like this happened immediately, right? It wasn't like the government and the Army were reticent to admitting these sorts of allegations from day one. In fact, they went after the very journalists who reported on the whistleblower who came out with these allegations to begin with. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a very good point. We don't really know what would have happened if whistleblowers, very courageous members of SASR and Commando, the special forces involved, but also journalists in Australia who put themselves in a very difficult position and have suffered as a result of this national conscience. But having said that, it sounds from what we know that there was a willingness on the part of the Australian Army, or at least some parts of the Australian Army, to open this up for investigation, and 4 years of pretty careful forensic investigation, as has been said, heavily redacted. So we'll wait to see what comes out. But it is in some ways a credit to the Australian Army that they've opened this up to the public, but also, as you say, the main drivers forward were a combination of civilian journalists and also some whistleblowers within the special forces.
What are your thoughts about the entire raids on the ABC journalists and ABC headquarters as well? That was something that has still left a bitter taste in the mouth, hasn't it?
I think that's right. I mean, it's not the only recent event where federal police have gone in where they haven't, in relation to a news story that has been somewhat critical of government in some way or another. But I think at the moment there's been a bit of a pulling back of on behalf of our law enforcement authorities that they, that infringing on the freedom of journalists to expose this kind of scandal. And I think, one has to pay credit to the journalists and some of the individuals inside the armed forces in Australia to actually bring this matter to light. So, obviously governments don't like this sort of message. It's a bitter pill to swallow. But we're seeing now with this Inspector General's report, the fact that it's come to light, and there's a lot there that has to be digested and responded to.
This, as I said in my introduction, has had an effect certainly on Afghans too, right? I mean, I've seen a number of reports about Afghans who have been at the receiving end and/or their family members have been victims of these alleged crimes by Australian troops, as well as other coalition troops as well. Certainly, it's not like Australia was only there. But what do you make of that aspect of all this? The long-lasting effects that this may have had in a country like Afghanistan, which, as we well know, is trying very hard to finalize a peace deal?
Yeah, well, I think Australia's had a long military and development engagement with Afghanistan since around 2002, and it's taken a variety of different aspects, some much more focused on improving governance and the operation of justice and so on. And this is a very small part, I guess, in Afghanistan and the use of special forces that's really, I think, sullied and overshadowed probably in most of many Afghans, the other work that's been done. But there it is, it's out there in the public. And I can tell from the nature of public debates here in Australia that the suggestions that are coming from within Afghanistan and also from Australia to compensate, to apologise to the families who are directly affected by some of these incidents is quite, I think, strong. And I expect that there will be compensation coming and there will be formal apologies if there haven't been some already, because there is, I think, a palpable revulsion at some of the details and an intent to make good. And let's hope that they do make good in ways that are appreciated.
Damian, I wonder, the argument on the part of some is being made that, listen, in a war situation, in a country like Afghanistan, that these things, are not completely unexpected to have happened, unfortunately. Collateral damage, those words that are used, those keywords that are used. Is that too optimistic, too generous of us to be excusing this as that?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is. War is by definition murderous, and so you would expect there to be a level of brutality in war and also damage not only to civilians in some ways but also to soldiers who have to mete out lawful violence. But the point is, violence has to be carried out through the rules of law, and in this case it's very clear that the actions of some soldiers has been completely outside the rules of law and completely unacceptable. I think there's a sense of incredible disquiet and sadness in Australia that our armed forces have engaged, or some members of our armed forces have engaged in completely unlawful behaviour, and that can't be forgiven. And I understand that asymmetric warfare throws up various complexities for the people that engage in the space where they're essentially an occupying force, but that doesn't forgive the actions of some people, and it's good that it's been called out.
And then, the other issue then is that, is it good enough for Australia to be policing itself on this issue? Right? There's been talk, of course, as you well know, about the ICC, for example, investigating American troops and their actions in Afghanistan during the time that they were there. And of course, we know the Trump administration especially has gone very tough against any such investigation, in fact, even sanctioning the international court. What do you think the international community, the ICC, for example, should have, if any, in what Australian troops may have done in Afghanistan?
Well, they should have a very keen interest. This is a very painstaking report, as has been pointed out, heavily redacted. So we'll wait to see what the full findings are, and also the individuals who may be charged with criminal acts have not been identified as yet to the public. But there should be a strong interest from the international community. Having said that, Australia has a strong tradition of the rule of law, and I expect that the prosecutions will be very transparent, and it's now in the public interest that occurs. I agree with you. If you think about special forces internationally and think of our Five Eyes allies, I think Australia has stepped out onto ground that no one else is yet on. I note that the British have actually put a statute of, well, they're putting a bill to Parliament which involves a statute of limitations, which effectively means that none of their forces could be prosecuted for war crimes in Afghanistan. So these things are always sensitive, but I expect that there'll be not only public scrutiny in Australia, but a good deal of international scrutiny in terms of where things go from here in terms of prosecution.
All right, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go this evening. What are your thoughts about the international community's role in all of this, certainly, and whether or not this is then setting an example, a precedent then, as Damian there alluded to, for the other countries that have, in fact, gone the opposite way of Australia, at least at this point, in not being as transparent and accountable to A, their own citizens, and B, Afghans?
I think we're setting an interesting example and hopefully a precedent whereby we are prepared to be, as a nation, self-critical and to look in depth into the actions of our armed forces and to think deeply about what we ask of special soldiers, special unit soldiers like we have in Afghanistan, doing effectively counterinsurgency work. I mean, it's a very, as Damian pointed out, very sort of unusual and particular and demanding job. But, as a nation, I think we might be setting a precedent, not just in investigating and seeking to prosecute people and hopefully transparently and as fairly as possible, but looking behind it into the issues of culture and command responsibility, I think, is one of the issues that's coming up in the Australian press at the moment. One can look at the rank and file culture, but if we can look at some of these other issues of culture and command responsibility, then I think it's not just a matter of prosecuting the people that have committed things in the past. It's about setting the tone for how special forces soldiers operate in the future. So if that should be, I think, a very powerful example internationally, hopefully to our allies and to others.
We'll leave it there at that, but we do sincerely appreciate both Andrew and Damian for their time this evening and for sharing their expert insight with us on the Australia War Crimes Report, which, as I said, continues to create waves. Is this an important precedent? Is this an important example? As I put to Damian as well, it's not like Australia made this an easy process or came out immediately to be able to accept this form of accountability and transparency. Mind you, the report still is very redacted, so we don't have many details, likely to have a lot more harrowing details about what Australian forces are alleged to have done towards innocent Afghans on the ground while they were serving there during the time that they were. The effect on Afghans is, of course, clear. It's important to always center the fact that it's the innocent Afghans who have suffered at the hands of not only coalition forces, but other forces certainly as well, and that those innocent lives, those sacred lives, need to be prioritized. The victims need to be spoken of, need to be understood as well, so that the rest of the world knows that an Afghan life is worth just as much as an Australian life or otherwise. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In the final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss a report and emails that have come out from the U.S. Border Agency. Now, this hasn't gotten a lot of media attention, but it's linked to a lot of Iranians that traveled to the U.S. around the time of the Soleimani assassination, and even Iranian-Americans, so i.e. U.S. citizens who were traveling back to America. Some of them through Vancouver. There was a huge gathering, a social gathering of Iranians in the West in Vancouver around that time, I believe for a concert, and a lot of them who were returning via the British Columbia border were then detained, some of them for many hours. And this all was seemingly covered up by a lot of officials at the time. Certainly, it was a time of great tension between Iran and the United States, but the U.S. Constitution does not allow for anybody to be held at the border just because of their country of origin. It is illegal, according to American law, to do that. So the border agency tried to cover it up. But now we have emails that have come out that proves that, in fact, there was a list of countries handed out to border agents at that time to, again, target not just Iranian Americans and Iranians in general who were traveling to the U.S., but also a host of other countries as well. We're going to discuss this further. Now we're joined by Hamidreza Gholamzadeh, who is a foreign policy analyst. He's joining us today from the Iranian capital, Tehran. Hamidreza, thank you for your time. What do you make of what happened here at the border? Because, you know, certainly we had the tensions between the two countries, but then should this reflect upon normal citizens of either country who are traveling back and forth, either Americans traveling to Iran or Iranians traveling to America?
Thank you very much for having me, Waqar. There are 2 points about this story. First is that generally the United States is trying to put as much pressure as possible on Iranian people and to actually deprive them of normal situation, normal life, either inside Iran or outside Iran. It doesn't make any difference to them. What they are trying to do is to segregate them from the other people, other nationalities, and tell them that you are actually responsible for what is going on in Iran. And they want to put pressure on Iranians everywhere around the world so that they turn against actually the Islamic Republic. The second point is about the time frame of the events, which was after the assassination of the General Soleimani, the most favorable person in Iran, and he was a top figure in war against terrorism in our region, in Western Asia. The point is that the Americans knew that they were actually committing the crime against him, and they have done something wrong, and they fear actually not only then, they now even fear the consequences of that event. They know that there will be some revenge on that, and there will be there would be consequences for the assassination that they have committed. And because of that, they are fearful about that. So they resort to even actions which are not only against the U.S. Constitution, but also against the human rights and against the international law. Separating people based on nationality or other criteria people are born to is against the human rights and against the American Constitution, as you mentioned as well. So they are doing everything, and they have been actually doing at that time and also afterward. They're doing everything to actually try to fix the mistake that they have done, but they cannot do that in that way.
You know, what's interesting, Hamidreza, is that as you and I well know, I mean, a lot of the Iranians, and this can go for any people of any country really, who live outside of their respective countries, they don't necessarily support their governments back home, right? So it's not necessary that a lot of the Iranians who were detained at the American border during the time of or around the time of the Soleimani assassination were actually, you know, pro-Iran in the sense of pro-Islamic Republic. This actually creates more enemies in a sense and more dislike for the American system, doesn't it, even on the part of people that would naturally support it?
Sure it is. Actually, it's one of the let's say, mistakes that Trump administration has been doing for the last couple of years is that they are destroying the image of the United States, and that is part of that. So they don't think rationally, they don't act rationally in foreign policy, and that's why they put ban on issuing visa for Muslim countries. They put pressure, more pressure on migrants from other countries, and also about the Iranians and some other Muslim countries. They are putting pressure on that. And they don't think that either the person is actually a pro-Iran or against Iran. The point is that the term Iranian should be actually stigmatized, and they want to label it as something bad to be Iranian, and to make Iranians be shameful about their nationality and the origin belonging to the Islamic Republic of Iran. That's the mindset in the American government and administration. They think that if they label every Iranian as something bad, everything Iranian as something bad, and something difficult, then all the Iranians would turn against the establishment and the government in Iran. And they assume that this will help them to actually go for the regime change that they are vying for.
As a follow-up then, Hamidreza, I'm going to ask you a tough question. I'm going to put you on the spot. What is the Iranian policy then when it comes to American citizens, right? Is this a tit-for-tat sort of thing? I mean, does Iran also treat American citizens with suspicion?
Of course not. We have a lot of Americans coming to Iran, going to Iran. Of course, not now because of the coronavirus situation, but before that. And hopefully after that, many Americans have been going to Iran for tourism, for business, for any other reasons. Iran is an open country to many nationalities. We have some areas, free zone areas inside Iran, where people can go even without a visa. Even the Americans go there without a visa. So it's not the tit-for-tat situation, because it is actually against the policies of the Islamic Republic to actually, let's say, to be hostile to other nationals and people, normal. We are talking about normal people and common people. Yes, when it comes to the officials, when it comes to the politicians, it's a different story. But when it comes to the people, the civilians and the common people, Iran doesn't follow such a policy to retaliate in actually against the American nationals. So no, I don't see any situation, and there has not been based on experience and based on actually the rules, that there is no pressure on Americans or other Western nationals.
We'll leave it there at that, Hamidreza, but we do sincerely appreciate your taking your time out of your busy schedule to share your thoughts with us. That was Hamidreza Gholamzadeh speaking to us today from the Iranian capital, Tehran, sharing his thoughts on this story about, U.S. border agents detaining Iranians. The number, I believe it was around 80 of them were U.S. citizens, and 250 plus were subjected to secondary screenings as well. This was, of course, all around the time of the Soleimani assassination. A lot of these people were returning from a concert, I believe it was in Vancouver, of an Iranian artist. artist, singer. You know, a lot of these people probably or may not have even been political in any way, shape, or form. Why would these people then be targeted in this fashion? Why would there be a suspicion simply because of the fact that their country of origin was Iranian, even though many of them were U.S. citizens? This is against, of course, American law in and of itself. And of course, why also isn't this a bigger story at this time? Why would it be okay for U.S. citizens to then be treated in a different fashion simply because of their countries of origin? I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.